Well, Vice-Chancellor Ian Jacobs, Professor and Dean Alex Arns, the Deputy Lord Mayor, distinguished guests, graduates, students, alumni and friends. I once asked my 20-year-old daughter, majoring in psychology, about what I should say at a university graduation address. And she said without hesitation, "Be entertaining, Dad, and don't be an old bore." So you see, I carry this burden of wisdom, even now, knowing that if I'm not entertaining, I clearly know where I stand in the alternate. It's indeed an honour for me to be invited this evening to give this Reid Lecture in Urban Design, marking the 20th anniversary of this Masters of Urban Development and Design program, and a significant milestone it is. Perhaps the finest course of its type in the country, the language and detailed knowledge of urban design has become the currency and active tool of city life and city evolution. And for any of you who do not know yet the difference between architecture and urban design, or indeed an architect or an urban designer, I will give you a clue. And that is, if you see someone with a camera patiently waiting for everyone to get out of the picture, that's an architect. And if they're patiently waiting to see as many people as possible get in the shot, that's an urban designer. Now, cities can be grinding crucibles to some, stepping stones to others. They can repel people or draw people. Their spirit can be polished by optimism, dulled by regret. And when we think of the great cities around the world, we often visualise images of the physical wealth of one-time global empires built on the backs of colonial supply chains. But not here, not in Sydney. And we forget that Melbourne was once more populous, richer, and more internationally significant than Sydney, thanks to the price of Victorian gold. It was once the capital of finance, unionism, and superannuation, and the first home to our Commonwealth Parliament until we struck a compromise in the Molonglo Valley. But Federation made us grow up and think about the physical attributes and the functions of a city. Royal commissions and studies followed. The Second World War reprioritised social concerns like housing and hospitals. And at around 4%, post-war growth was indeed rapid. Materials and labour was rationed. By the 1960s, years of industrial soot, air pollution and heritage and environmental degradation was being challenged for the first time, and when some of the most poorly argued urban concepts were being bandied about. Now, since 1970 or thereabouts, the City of Sydney Corporation, with its fragile autonomy and little powers, has been trying to recover the city for people, for pedestrians, with freight and car interests fierce opponents. Plans to transform parts of central Sydney for human life are greater than ever before as economic preferences and cultural and commercial interests align. Denser cities can be the healthiest, greenest, most stimulating place for people with the least environmental footprint. And this has been economist Edward Glazer's thesis and the city's underlying aim. But the tallest cities are not necessarily the densest or the healthiest or the most stimulating. The quality of city life is found in the space between buildings, places to be, places to soak up, social citizenry and ambience, which is harder to achieve with the taller buildings framing such space. The city's focus is to exact a life for people between buildings and incentivise design and development solutions that improve the city on the ground, not just in the air. And behind all urban transformations, technological change lurks. Sydney's first ever revolution came with steam. The second came with transport, communication and power. And in the third, manufacturing and heavy industries moved out and fibre optics and Wi-Fi moved in. Networking, the no-collar, big dollar, knowledge workers, and they've become the new drivers of change. So where are we transforming from? For over 70 years, Sydney-siders have been struggling with a vehicle-choked city. The iconic bridge's magnetic attraction pulled commuters from the north. Car use grew at 13% a year. To improve vehicle movements, the largest tram system in the world was dismantled. Lofty post-war reconstruction talk filled the political air with new housing estates and sweeping expressway plans. Town planning was legalised in 1945, when Premier Karl created our first metro coordinating planning body, the County of Cumberland Council. The same kind of idea has resurfaced again some 70 years later with the notional Greater Sydney Commission, perhaps the fourth or even fifth attempt at such a metro planning body. The 1951 county plan was its gift. But to be honest, it failed. The County Council's job was to be independent of ministers, coordinate the work of councils and rein in the czar-like commissioners of railways, roads, housing, water and sewers. Sounds familiar? Its weapon of choice was zoning. Its intentions were honourable, but doomed. Metropolitan farming, intended to be preserved by a greenbelt, was soon whittled away by ministers and mayors. In 1953, Cabinet overrode the greenbelt for the Kurnell oil refinery, and 6 years later, the relevant minister released 130 square kilometres of greenbelt land to developers, much like today, except it was unwatered and unsewered. And the protracted deadlock between government and the developers that followed ushered in the era of infrastructure charges and mandatory concurrences by statutory authorities. Of 285,000 industrial workers in 1947, 30,000 were in textile, clothing, food preparation and printing in the city core. 142,000 were in sectors like animal products, engineering foodstuffs, chemicals and heavy manufacturing, including car assembly, locomotive and carriage building. This was a manufacturing city with very visible smoke and flame from combustion. And the toxic harbour's timber-edged wharfage and bonded foreshores were largely inaccessible to the public west of the bridge. With a blue and white-collar workforce, a mixed manufacturing sector and centralised produce at the Haymarket, the city's growth was seen as entirely limited by traffic generation. And the response was floor space rationing through FSR controls. And today, the city centre's growth is more likely to be limited by footpath widths and the capacity of public transport services rather than private vehicle growth. And besides freight, an argument for new freeways was drawn from Copenhagen police data, of all places. Road accident data in 1951 showed Sydney and Melbourne had the highest rate of road fatalities, compared to a dozen other global cities. Drivers, it was decided, must be saved by eliminating intersections. And on the congestion front, the city centre, here we go. Looks like, there we go. On the congestion front, the city centre was to be protected by a ring of expressways linked to the bridge. Traffic would bypass the city and access perimeter parking stations and workplaces. And parking stations along Kent and Sussex Street, under the Domain and over the tracks at Goulburn Street mark this legacy. There was logic, but unintended consequences were not factored in. Alternatives included demolishing buildings to widen streets like Oxford Street or William Street, or perhaps, with less logic or amenity, elevating a pneumatic, tired, super trolley system above George, Pitt and Castlereagh Streets, as was suggested here. And broadly, what was not considered was any kind of restriction on vehicles or vehicle movements within the city centre. On the contrary, on-site parking requirements were actually introduced. 3 years after Joe Carl decided to proceed with the Utzon's Opera House, which is reflected in this lecture title series, his Labor successor, Bob Heffron, put all 8 hectares of the rocks out to private tender. What? The winning Wallace and Edwards, the EMTB, bid would then morph, it was thought, into developer-driven planning controls, something like a dry run for Barangaroo. And despite fierce protests at the time, the government was unmoved until it was kneecapped by the union's green bands. And if not that, the lack of big capital and demand would have probably done it in as well. So the idea failed, and the Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority, the brainchild of the NCDC, Sir John Overall, instead became a loving landlord. And you could say that the tug of wars between state intervention and the role of the city as a planning authority began, like settlement itself, at Sydney Cove. Woolloomooloo as a second CBD for an estimated 35,000 workers was another SPA, that is State Planning Authority, proposal, while the council was sacked and the commissioners were installed. And you'll see where the Eastern Distributor ploughs right through. Blocks on either side were of, let's say, special interest to well-dressed men in white shoes with a bit of bother on hand. Now, this never officially approved scheme was nevertheless torpedoed by Whitlam and discouraged by Emmett McDermott's Civic Reform Council through its revolutionary 1971 strategic plan by George Clark and MSJ, and a quiet nod to Darryl Conybeare. The 1971 zoning plan by the SPA reveals the peak of road intentions: the demolition of South Paddington, of Chippendale, Alexandria housing and Glebe. And this expressway scheme, based on 1945 transport assumptions, was thankfully killed off by the new politics at all levels, at city, state and federal. But yet again, Whitlam played the ultimate trump card, authorising Commonwealth land acquisitions in their path. In the 1960s to 80s ferment, container technology displaced wooden wharves, releasing the harbour edges, and print technology, textiles, container and power generation moved out. The city centre workforce went from generalist to specialist, and for years the workforce numbers fell. Early start blue-collar workers turned to office hour white, and Bradfield's electrified yet historic rail service absorbed yet more and more commutes. The vast Everleigh rail carriage and locomotive works were closed, and the southern industrial tanneries, the heavy manufacturers and produce markets and their rail sidings moved out, taking their freight in their flight. And now, 30 years on, Sydney has evolved into Australia's major financial centre and home to many world-leading businesses. It is a base for the growing banking, technology and professional and specialist service sectors, with a highly skilled workforce expected to be in the order of 450,000 across the LGA in 2031. So this patch of 26 square kilometres has attracted 40% of Sydney's job growth over 5 years, and with over 25 billion worth of development being approved in a decade by the council alone. And in all this, Sydneysiders had wanted a walkable city. And this started with the closing of Martin Place outside the GPO in September 1971. A city that values the old and the new, a thriving city that feels loved and lived in. Just how people feel, use and how they relate to places, the personality of cities, is the emotive transformational challenge. Very few cities composed entirely of new buildings have a compelling personality. To preserve great architecture, the council developed a pioneering transferable heritage floor space scheme for conserving heritage buildings with now 40 years of results. Other projects that don't transfer but in fact consolidate their floor space have rejuvenated heritage buildings as well. All projects in the City of Sydney area must achieve design excellence, and major projects must result for a competitive design process. The city extended competitive design processes beyond the city centre to urban renewal areas in 2012. It has lifted the quality of architecture, of public art and landscape design from 20th century modern mundane. And the city has acquired the skills to engage with developers and, where appropriate, guide public benefits like childcare centres or cycle facilities, or publicly accessible creative arts and rehearsal spaces for community use. And almost all new office towers have end-of-trip facilities, including bike racks, showers, change rooms and lockers, currently excused from floor space calculations. Now, the tools of strategic transformation are reasoned public policy. At the city, policies promote design excellence, street-level business, fine-grained frontages, new parks and plazas, residential diversity, high-quality street finishes, furniture and signage, no minimum parking requirements, restricted on-street parking for new apartment developments, car share, green travel plans for major developments. I go on. Now, design excellence requires competitive processes, design processes we call them, for both private and public projects. In effect, design procurement becomes a more public conversation around strategic design issues. And over 15 years in operation, this has now matured into a highly effective competitive design policy that has contributed to the city's growth and its amenity. Many cities now inquire about the workings of this policy, from Parramatta to New York. And in that policy, there are two alternatives. For more formal competitions, there's a juror selection evenly divided between public and private interests. And here in AMP's 50 Bridge Street, we have 2 client reps 2 former state government architects, the city's Director of Design, and your own Faculty Dean, Professor Alexander. Alternatively, any developer would choose architectural services through their internal processes. However, in this more externalised procurement process, invited proposals, in this case for AMP, by Sana from Japan, Morphosis from the US, MVRDV from the Netherlands, 3XN from Denmark, were put up against AMP's choice of Architectus with Christoph Engelhoven and FJMT. In the case of 60 Martin Place, a future tower opposite the Reserve Bank, the design excellence process for this considered both international and local schemes. But in this case, Sydney-based Hassel was selected by the jury, having regard to architectural, environmental, workplace and urban design considerations. But smaller and no less important projects, including the replacement of the prominent Crest Hotel in King's Cross with a mixed-use scheme, including apartments. Conversations through the design excellence process help to close the gap between developer intentions and the city's expectations and assist the resolution of complex issues such as, in this case, retained uses, the railway station, view lines and street acoustics. And if I turn our attention to the city's own assets, ageing infrastructure has been methodically replaced with more sustainable systems. As custodian of the citizens' commonwealth, and I'll use that phrase in the original sense, the city has rebuilt parks, pools, libraries, theatres, community centres, recreational centres, playgrounds, childcare, with 3 design aims: quality of social service, environmental footprint, and life cycle costs, delivered within the framework of excellent design. For example, a number of former town halls have been upgraded as community venues. And here the Sydney Town Hall has had its first full external and internal restoration, including essential services upgrade, communication and venue upgrade, seismic strengthening, including the clock tower, and energy efficiency framework. But at another extreme, the program of micro-transformation of social and community infrastructure over the last 10 years has also drawn international attention. And this is partly due to the city putting its own community projects through the same design excellence program, including competitive design process. And can I say, the willingness to change scope and change design midstream makes consultation and review purposeful. In the case of this Waterloo skate park, user consultation brought a now highly regarded yet strongly revised layout. And the Weave Youth Services, Weave meaning working to educate, advocate and empower, is the grated building with its vine and flower covered galvanised crown entirely separate to the skate deck. Co-located with the skate park and what was a former netball toilet block has been turned into 2 levels of meeting spaces for 74 workers and 80 volunteers, assisting thousands of 12 to 25-year-olds in need who can discreetly slip in for help. Now, the transformation of Prince Alfred Park and Pool likewise benefited from critique and an open mind. Here, Council and its design advisory panel, mid-design development, recommended a rethink so that the facility was more a part of the park, even perhaps enveloped by the park, simultaneously resolving privacy, sightlines and green cover. And in this instance, the design review process and the response by the architects and landscape architects produced an outstanding result. If we think of the 2007 Ian Thorpe pool, which resulted from an invitation-only competition that uniquely considered competitors on the basis that they did not participate in the preceding open competition, which was abandoned. Seidler's last building lies in the heart of Ultimo, which according to the ABS is now the densest locality in Australia at around 14,300 persons per square kilometre. Streets ahead of Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay these days. And the city's 2008 plan, in some ways, is comparable to the 1971 strategic plan, and it is entitled Sustainable Sydney 2030. It sets out some principles and actions to rebuild and enhance depleted inner city residential areas. It aims to make more self-sufficient the village centres, village, and I use that in the New York rather than the English sense, located where existing community infrastructure and businesses are already located. For example, in the Surrey Hills Library, Crown Street, where it's situated, is a defined activity street in that plan. And the renewal of the library opposite the park and pub and next to shops was a conscious urban statement for identity as much as a multi-use program for books to Tai Chi and childcare. And completed in 2009, we look at the results. The site experienced a five-fold increase in visitors to more than 250,000, 250,000 visits a year, with a local library membership jumping to 15,000, unheard of. Now holds more than 70 classes a week across a surprisingly wide range of subject matter. And in contrast, bought, renovated and refitted this former Baptist tabernacle that lost its congregation is part of the cultural program to rebuild a writing, performance and production capacity that was once in Sydney. And the building is as important as the management model. The Eternity Theatre seeks open submissions for new and co-produced works and delivers 200 performances to 30,000 theatregoers each year. The plays come to them. At the local level, neighbourhoods that once barely survived resumption have been gradually transformed through up-to-date assets and equitable access. For example, below the grandstand built here, of 2,500 people at the Redfern Oval, the gates around the Rabbitohs training ground, when not in use, are swung open so that the Victorian Park users have equal access to the field for DIY exercise and training. And with Pyrmont Ultimo, the densest locality in Australia, open space acquisition was important, as was removing an inaccessible waterfront from the Harbour Foreshore Walk puzzle. With the completion of Barangaroo, it will be possible to promenade from Woolloomooloo Bay to the Anzac Bridge and beyond when the future fish market redevelopment happens. To transform this once bleak waterfront, the city acquired the site from the state and after the Water Police moved. But thankfully, being a flat wharf over water, the design for Pyramid Park included simply eroding the decks to create mini harbour with stairs that simply go down to the water, like perhaps Varanasi, making a safe haven for harbour swimming or paddling. And a final example of local infrastructure creation or renewal is the Paddington Reservoir Gardens project, which required the grunt of the city to get up because the site had been fenced off for years following a roof collapse of the old and empty water reservoir under South Sydney Council. And here we see some transformations are quite literal. This has the least defined use of all parks, a place you can get lost in. So turning to the city centre, the improvements include 80 new fine grain businesses, 60 businesses operating in laneways across the city. There have been upgrades of Pitt Street Mall, Kimber Lane, Bulletin Place, Angel Place and Ash Street, to name a few. And these places now cater for the increasing demand for cafes, restaurants, bars and places to people watch. The potential upgrade of Ash Street and Angel Place, behind Martin Place, was identified in the laneway revitalisation strategy. Sydney's secondary pedestrian spaces in lanes are in small clusters, unlike Melbourne's secondary grid. And all the wall surfaces of the existing lanes were mapped for potential uses. And where new uses were possible, the spaces were upgraded with traffic management, paving, lighting and artworks. For example, the public artwork installation in Angel Place is Forgotten Songs by Hill, Major, Wong and Towie, and it includes 120 suspended bird cages emanating the pre-recorded sounds of the bird life that would have once lived above that location at Tank Stream. And the lane experience is also tied into the audience experience of the recital hall and the Theatre Royal. And then in the Haymarket, a nest of lanes like Factory Street, Little Hay Street and Kimber Lane are connections and alleyways between Chinatown's bustling streets. And again, to promote walking and foot movement, Kimber Lane has been infused with this three-dimensional work entitled In Between Two Worlds by part Aboriginal, part Chinese artist Jason Wing. And the extremely wistful, almost beautiful use of 30 suspended illuminated spirit figures is enhanced by recognisable cloud mural patterns painted on the walls and set into the granite paving. The figures even provide directions. The many temporary and permanent installations shown in the city's public art program are designed to enhance the pedestrian experience and to enrich street life on foot. The city itself invests in public art, as well as requiring major development to contribute public art, the selection of which is overseen by a public art panel appointed by full council to review submissions and to make occasionally controversial recommendations. Temporary works relate to festivals and programs. Working with the Powerhouse Museum, the illuminated woven mesh installation by Janet Eckelman called Tsunami 1.26 coincided with the 2011 Art and About Festival opening and was suspended for about a month over George Street. And here position and proposition allows artists to tantalise the walker. And since every major project must include a public art strategy, the city's own facilities are likewise included. Here at Prince Alfred Park Pool, 12 chamfered or chamfer painted chimneys entitled Shades of Green by Sonia van der Haar mediate between the pool blue and the green park without giving away their rather practical purpose as trigen flues. So, where are we transforming to? According to today's Australian Financial Review, and I quote, "Some of the biggest development projects in Sydney CBD are coming to a head, with Lend-Lease, Dalian Wanda Group and Visionary Investment Group sharpening their plans." And it goes on. In Sydney Circular Quay, Chinese development giant Wanda is expected to advance its plans on its Goldfields house site without joining forces with other major landholders on the block. Mirvac Executive of Commercial Development David Rolls is quoted, "We are working very closely with Council to allow for the broader precinct view to happen. We are very much a supporter of the bigger picture for the area." Unquote. As this article suggests, over the next 10 years, the city will have moved up a notch to the next level of complex transformations while maintaining the small grain renewals and upgrades which make such a difference at the local and personal level. So what is in the pipeline? And I'll touch on a few examples. The George Street pedestrian boulevard, with integrated light rail by the state government, will be a big picture game changer, and credit must go to the state for this. The current plan is a raised granite paving from Hunter to Bathurst Street, with 25,000 square metres of liberated road space for pedestrians. At this stage, about half of the original length developed by Jahn and the city is planned. The aim was and is to connect Circular Quay to Central Railway with Town Hall as the halfway point. The boulevard design for the pedestrian priority is generous, open, free from clutter. It proposes very distinctive trees, a cultivar, green vase, Zelkova serrata, lighter coloured paving, new custom designed furniture, night lighting tailored to people, not to cars. Better streets go hand in hand with economic activity and greater opportunity for social activity and engagement. In this case, 220 diesel and gas-powered buses per hour will be relocated. The integration of laneways and land use to take full advantage of the additional public space is studied in detail. Flow paths, view cones from buildings, entries, arcades and streets have all been mapped in each block to help position trees, benches and flex zones where things happen. The consistent long-term vision spanning consecutive City of Sydney administrations requires land acquisition, integrated state and city planning and major funding. I mean big dollars. The city has already acquired the key buildings and awaits a major development impetus. For example, the Sydney Rapid Transit with a new station in Pitt Street or a second harbour crossing for this plan for Town Hall Square to be realised. New lanes and connections will be built when traditionally they are swept aside for development. A number of privately funded projects in development include new lanes with fine-grained tenancies up to 100 square metres to encourage small businesses at ground, first floor and basement levels. New public pedestrian spaces and plazas, which are not just another forecourt to an office tower, are possible. While Jahn studies of George Street imagined a spine with 3 squares, Circular Quay at one end, Railway Square at the other, Town Hall in the middle, he also imagined small squares and plazas along the way as stopping points. And yes, a positive new smaller square, edged by finely scaled buildings in George Street, is under study. Beneath the square might be a public cycle facility for retail or other workers or higher use for day tourists from the 200 plus cruise ships which come into town. And nearby, a new pedestrian environment will be created south of Alfred Street, making the waterfront more porous and fine-grained. Realising the pedestrian ground plane with connections, lanes and squares is a critical aim of the vast AMP project. In accordance with the approved Design Excellence Strategy, AMP have commissioned architects 3XN, SJB, the New South Wales Emerging Architect of the Year, Sean Carter, the Victorian Emerging Architect of the Year, Melissa Bright, Sylvester Fuller and Aspect to work individually and together in a landmark collaborative effort to enrich both the buildings and the public domain experience. And nearby at 71 Macquarie Street, project designed by Jahn Associates, a new grand staircase connection will be built by Mirvac. Nervy-esque, perhaps, in moulded concrete soffites, wall and stair finishes to match. This will frame through a portal to allow permanent public access to Botanic Gardens and Macquarie Street from the quay. And from Macquarie Street, people will see Sydney Cove for the first time through a new full-height view slot. Now, this recently approved design resolves the three-dimensional nature of a very exposed site to the expressway, extending the colonnade in proportion rhythm, no higher than the amateur building it replaces, and the public benefits include dedication of all the airspace above the building to the city, as well as dedication of the entire airspace in the colonnade and the grand staircase to the city for permanent public use. Further afield, in Green Square, future public projects include the plaza and embedded library centrepiece for the Green Square Town Centre, which will be the village heart for 50,000 residents, maybe 20,000 workers. The library and plaza ground plan by Felicity Stewart and Matthias Hollenstein and Colin Stewart, who I think is here, will be lined with services, food, retail, entertainment, and it's directly linked to a future park, future childcare, community services, future aquatic centre, and the Ganyama Park Sports Park. Now, unlike most new town centres, the buildings around the plaza will need to be designed to cope with the nightlife and activity at the front door rather than a passive outlook. The plaza will be programmed with events and festivals to bring a focus to the new southern redevelopment area, as well as being activated by these continuous retail edges. And further along the way, the Green Square Aquatic Centre and Ganyama Park, which was the winning proposal by a Surrey Hills architect, Andrew Burgess, anonymously shortlisted in an international jury competition by an eminent jury, and that is from a raft of international entries. It was quite something. The pool within a pool concept, the outer rock pool, is a social activator that will open up pool use to the whole community, from lappers to nippers and lazybones. And located in what was originally a wetland of Botany Sands, the former Waterloo Swamp, in fact, this Ganyama Park has been conceived as a kind of reconstructed wetland scrub with spaces carved out. And the connecting element in the park is a kind of timber boardwalk, linking all the park activities to the pool, marking the threshold between active and indigenous wetland landscapes. And the proposal will deliver the 6th public pool facility in the City of Sydney, in keeping with the population growth. And it draws inspiration from the much-loved tradition of Sydney's coastal rock pools, this unique design emphasising the pleasurable and informal potential of the local swimming pool program as a catalyst for expanding broader community appeal. The indoor functions include 50-metre pool, 25-metre indoor program pool, indoor leisure and hydrotherapy pools, health and fitness centre. And included is a new sports park with a multi-purpose field, skate ramp, large children's playground, outdoor fitness stations, barbecue, picnic areas, you name it, roads and drainage thrown in. Back in the city centre, new ways of working in the knowledge economy is driving investment in the workplace. Technology has swapped the office for a tablet, and Wi-Fi could turn the city into a virtual meeting place. In this AMP designed by 3XN, a series of segmented day-lit atria are key to the tower concept of vertical villages, which I will show you in a minute. Corporates are using the most accomplished designers now to develop spaces of international standing rather than international standard that will attract and retain premium talent. While hopes were once on global investment banks expanding in Sydney, and perhaps they still are, Sydney is now being considered by global high technology companies, not naming names, but the likes of Twitter, Dropbox and more. The decision by fast-growing software developer Atlassian, makers of Jira, Bitbucket, HipChat, Confluence to grow in Sydney, and for Google regional offices to be further embedded in Sydney creates a real critical mass in this sector, and not in a Silicon Valley style suburban campus either. Entering the new workplace is not about hitting security in the lifts. In Hassel's 60 Martin Place proposal for investor, the pedestrian ground plane is given over to structured and unstructured interaction and to casual meetings. The urban design circumstances of the site are critical here. The change of level between Martin Place and Macquarie Street, the exposed presence of St Stephen's Uniting Church, and activation of Martin Place frontage. Combining the 60 Martin Place site with St Stephen's Church and Macquarie Street had many urban and workplace advantages. The deal secures the well-being of the congregation, unlocks the lower hall and modernises the church's public presence, whilst ensuring its heritage values are maintained, if not improved. And the architectural studies looking at the consolidation modelling issues were numerous. As with 3XN design for the AMP Tower, complete modular glazing units are becoming larger, and floor plates are not wedded to repetition as they once were, provided that spatial and daylight criteria are met. This creates more flexibility in modelling buildings for a better fit in tighter urban circumstances as the most valuable real estate is redeveloped. Now, with George Street as a great north-south pedestrian spine, the way developments interface with George Street and how additional towers are positioned has been the subject of study. In this example at 505 George Street, the city is considering a proposal to effectively stack the two towers one above the other to resolve separation and cross-viewing issues while improving overshadowing and wind downdrafts in George Street. This project in the pipeline and yet to be approved and subject to future architectural competition has a land use mix in George Street, which is very mixed. Over 550 apartments, 3,000 square metres of supermarket, 8,000 square metres of retail and cinemas, 640 cycle spaces, 2,600 square metres of childcare, and with the latter built and transferred to the city as a public asset. The city is hoping to increase affordable, well-located childcare centres as a matter of urgency. The unique preliminary design for two mirrored childcare centres open to the sky at the podium level is shown in this design by Co-op Architects. And this has given city staff the confidence to recommend proceeding with the offer to take on such a service. These preliminary designs will inform the scoping brief for a future competition if Council and the CSPC votes to proceed with the package. Much work has been done to negotiate the public benefits which are directly in line with Council's publicly identified strategic needs. And in the case of Greenland's Bathurst Street Tower, which is just beginning construction, an entirely different public benefit will be built. The design by James Gross of BVN provides 5 floors of creative space in the podium, a floor for dance rehearsal, one for performance rehearsal, one for music practice and rehearsal, one for creative workplaces, and a wet floor for fine arts, as well as a work-live studio apartment for fixed-term residents based on a creative fellowship program in perpetuity. The city is transforming for the better. The city's design excellence competition system has produced results like Foster's Lumiere, FJMT's 200 George Street, Engelhoven and Architectus' 1 Bly, Rogers 8 Chifley Place, FJMT's ANZ Tower, and soon 3XN's AMP Tower and Hassel's 60 Martin Place. And there are more. There are more to mention than I have time tonight. AMP's twin block proposal alone promises to reconfigure a good part of Circular Quay into a fine-grained, low-rise lane environment on the one hand and a green vertical village office tower on the other. So in conclusion, the ongoing transformation of the city centre continues a 40-year advocacy of reclaiming the city for people, block by block, project by project, with a very clear agenda on architectural quality, business growth, residential diversity, creative capacity, and livability. And through our changing economy, business, culture, and planning are aligning on the same page. Thank you.